Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask those in-house if you'll be so kind to check one last time that cell phones have been turned off. It is always appreciated. We will post the program on the Heritage homepage following today's presentations for your future reference. And, of course, we remind our Internet viewers that you're welcome at any time to email us with questions or comments simply using the email address speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Bob Moffett. Dr. Moffett is Senior Fellow for the Center for Health Policy Studies. He has long specialized in health care and entitlement programs, especially Medicare, and has been a key leader in efforts to formulate and improve our national health care policy. One reason he has such a silver-haired mane. Before joining Heritage, he served in the Reagan administration at the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as at the Office of Personnel Management. In 2010, he made the Modern Healthcare magazine's list of the 100 most powerful people in healthcare. He has written major articles in several print media and other publications and appears quite often in interviews. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bob Moffett. Bob?
Thank you. One of these days, I'm going to be able to exercise all this power that modern healthcare says that I have. So far, I don't seem to be doing very well. Ladies and gentlemen, the subject is budgets and deficits and spending and the Affordable Care Act. This is basically the 5th birthday of the Affordable Care Act. And Congress is faced with some very, very, very big decisions. I would say that Dr. Keith Hall, the new director of the Congressional Budget Office, has his work cut out for him. Here's what we're faced with. We're faced with a Congress that seems to be of two minds about its fiscal priorities. As you know, the congressional Republican leadership, House and Senate, have unveiled rather ambitious federal budget blueprints that promise to reduce federal spending by over $5 trillion over the next 10 years and achieve a balanced budget in 10 years. At the same time, the last week, Friday, the House Republican leadership also announced a major deal with Nancy Pelosi on repealing the troublesome sustainable growth rate formula for Medicare physician payment. Press reports indicate it would cost taxpayers $200 billion over 10 years. While the legislative language is not yet available, nor a CBO score is available, the crucial details of that deal are not entirely clear, but the major press reports indicate that only $70 billion of that tab is offset by budget savings. In other words, taxpayers are going to be faced with another $130 billion in deficits over the next 10 years. So I ask you to absorb a dramatic fact. We have a $200 billion Medicare deal with an estimated $130 billion in deficits, which is being promoted at the very same time by the same congressional Republican leadership that is trumpeting a balanced budget in 10 years. History is not quite repeating itself, but I think the similarities between the current debate and the previous debate 5 years ago are worth calling to your attention. In September of 2009, the President of the United States made a number of very high-profile promises. One of the most important was the following, quote, "I will not sign a plan that adds one dime to our deficits either now or in the future." It's kind of imperialistically ambitious. It's not suggesting that, he's suggesting basically that way into the future, onto the generations, basically we'll see fiscal rectitude. Well, one of the first tests of the president's resolve came with the SGR. The AMA, the American Medical Association, formally endorsed the enactment of the Senate bill, which really turned out to be Obamacare. And the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, estimated deficit neutrality for the Senate bill based on a key assumption. The assumption was the continuation of the sustainable growth rate. In other words, the assumption was the doctors would get a 21% reduction in their Medicare payment. The AMA endorsed the bill anyway. Go along, get along. That's the way things are done in Washington. That seems to be what AMA decided to do. But I just ask you to just imagine something just for one moment. Imagine any labor leader of any major union in the United States endorsing any major piece of legislation before the Congress that was premised on a 21% reduction in the paychecks of the workers on the assembly line. I want you to absorb that in your imagination. Nevertheless, the AMA endorsed the bill. If getting rid of the physician payment update was the litmus test for the AMA's political success, it didn't work out very well. In 2010, nevertheless, the CBO said that the law, its combination of revenues and Medicare payment reductions, would reduce the deficit by $124 billion by 2019. In 2014, however, the CBO declared that for a variety of reasons, it could no longer estimate the budget effects of the law. Among the budget hawks, CBO's revelation was not particularly shocking. That kind of declaration, however, is enough to sow seeds of doubt. The skeptics, of course, are here, including my Heritage Foundation colleagues, who've consistently argued that the fundamental design of the law would result in future deficits. The reason is pretty simple. It locks in massive spending, approximately $1.7 trillion over the next 10 years, and depends upon unstable revenue sources, such as the mandate penalties, the unpopular taxes, things like the medical device tax and the Cadillac tax, to offset that spending. Even if one believed, as the administration's allies evidently do, that the law's provisions constitute good policy, their fiscal potency is fanciful. Sober analysts at CBO and the Office of Medicare Actuary, for example, declared that the law's Medicare payment reductions, which are critical to achieving balance, to achieving deficit neutrality, are either unrealistic or unsustainable. Many of you know these things, but I have two outstanding speakers today who are going to talk about this in greater detail. Pat Knudsen is a former Heritage staffer. He was in the Roe Institute and handled budgetary affairs for the Roe Institute. He is now a consultant with the House Budget Committee and works with new chairman, Chairman Tom Price of Georgia. Our second speaker is Paul Winfrey. Paul Winfrey is now the director of the Roe Institute and handles budgetary affairs, federal budgetary policy for the Roe Institute. Paul comes to us more directly from the Senate Budget Committee, where he was a top budget analyst and a director of budget analysis in income support and health care for the past several years. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Mr. Pat Knudsen.
Thank you, Bob. And I first should say I want to thank the Heritage Foundation and Bob Moffett for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to see some of my friends and former colleagues again, and especially Frida Warren, who remains probably the warmest and most gracious person on the planet. I don't think there's any competition in that regard. I also need to issue a brief disclaimer. As Bob mentioned, I'm doing some part-time work with the House Budget Committee, but I'm not here speaking for the committee. Whatever I say is my own view, so I can say any lunatic thing I want and not embarrass anyone. In the paper we did last year, Bob and I examined specifically some of the fiscal components of the Affordable Care Act. Today, I'd like to take that a step further and try to look a layer below those things at how that kind of stuff happens, and I'll explain what I mean. About a year ago, Chuck Blahous wrote a piece in which he called the ACA the greatest act of fiscal irresponsibility ever committed by federal legislators. He said nothing came close. Now, Blahous is not one given to hyperbole, as you know, but here's his explanation for that description. Our biggest fiscal problem today stem from Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security costs rising well beyond original projections. The ACA was enacted even though these long-standing financing challenges have still not been met, and represents an additional expansion of federal commitments comparable to these other programs' creations. Now the question is, how is that allowed to happen? What kind of fiscal atmosphere is it that allowed the administration and Congress to adopt a new entitlement program that spends about $2 trillion a decade on top of these other commitments that we already can't afford? I want to suggest that it has something to do with how people look and think about the federal budget fundamentally. It's something that I call an ontological perspective on the budget, and I know how pretentious that sounds, but I'm a budget guy and I do that sort of thing. You might not be surprised to know that a lot of this goes back to John Maynard Keynes. As you know, the U.S. Congress didn't really adopt Keynesianism until around the 1970s, roughly 40 years after he had issued his theory. What it did, among a range of other things, is it gave Congress a rationale for deficit spending, one they hadn't had before. Or to put it another way, it gave lawmakers a justification for doing what they always wanted to do, spend without asking taxpayers to pay for it. And the results of that have been disastrous. First, we've gone for the past 45 years mostly operating on budget deficits. Deficits have become acceptable. Then they became accepted, and now they've become chronic. So we live with deficits almost all the time. There was one brief stretch in the 1990s when we did have budget surpluses, and that was principally because the Congress that came into place in 95 insisted on it and kept pushing the issue until President Clinton went along. That, of course, dissolved not too long after that, partly because of 9/11, and also because after 9/11, Congress took the lid off all spending, not just defense and homeland security. So we keep running deficits constantly. It's become a standard operating practice, and as we do that, the debt keeps growing. The second problem is actually a moral breakdown in budgeting attitudes, and I'll explain what I mean. In 95, when a balanced budget amendment was under consideration, James Buchanan, who had long advocated this sort of thing, wrote this: politicians prior to World War II would have considered it to be immoral, to be a sin, to spend more than they were willing to generate in tax revenues, except during periods of extreme and temporary emergency. To spend borrowed funds on ordinary items for public consumption was, quite simply, beyond the pale of acceptable political behavior. There were basic moral constraints in place. There was no need for an explicit fiscal rule in the written Constitution. Now that's an economist speaking. Economists don't usually talk that way. It's like a doctor saying when you're sick, he said, God made this happen. You just don't hear that sort of thing. But Buchanan did believe that, and for that reason, James Wilson, writing about that, said that Keynes was more than an important economist. He was actually a moral revolutionary who managed to break down what had been the one really fundamental, broadly understood constraint on spending, that you don't deficit spend unless you absolutely have to. The third ramification of that is that the balanced budget norm, while it existed, provided lawmakers and policymakers in general with a fiscal norm, some kind of basic understanding about what should be the underpinning of fiscal policy. When the balanced budget broke down, that was lost as well. And so now all of fiscal policy is adrift. Nobody really knows what a good standard should be, how big a deficit can be without being damaging, and how much debt we can absorb. You'll hear people talk about fiscal sustainability. That sounds pretty good, fiscal sustainability. In fact, I think I'm for that, at least as opposed to the alternative. But when you ask people,
good place to be.
When you ask people what fiscal sustainability means, it's a little hard to get it nailed down. You hear them talk about the ratio of debt to GDP and that sort of thing, but really it's all very unclear. It reminds me of St. Augustine when he said if he didn't think about it, he understood what time was, but if he had to explain it, he couldn't. That's what fiscal sustainability is as the new standard of whatever budgeting means. So all of that went into Obamacare, and it was translated into the newly minted pay-as-you-go. And I say newly minted because there was a time when the phrase pay-as-you-go meant balancing the budget. Now it means maintaining deficits. The idea is you can spend as much as you want on any new legislation you want as long as you can show on paper that it doesn't increase the deficit. even if the deficit is already $1 trillion. That's the definition of fiscal responsibility, and that's the one the ACA proponents used. They already had a $1 trillion deficit in 2010, and they said, well, we didn't raise that, so we're being fiscally responsible by adopting this new entitlement. That's the best we can do right now. That kind of relativism is what dominates the budget, and that's why, fundamentally, we're having so much difficulty getting back into balance, and even achieving, short of that, anything like fiscal sustainability. Nobody really knows what direction we're going. So my fundamental point in all this is that's what Obamacare demonstrated as the fundamental flaw in fiscal policy. And until we get a grip on what the standard of fiscal policy needs to be, we're going to be in this problem forever. And great countries have been brought down by their debt. Don't think it can't happen here. People once said that General Motors could never go bankrupt. But of course, we all know what happened there. So don't think that we can't suffer what other countries have suffered before over the long run. We need to get this under control, and to do that, we need to start with the fundamental principle of what fiscal policy is supposed to be and reach an agreed fiscal standard.
Thank you very much, Pat.
Thanks so much, Bob, for inviting me to make a few remarks and in providing me with an hour to make those remarks. That's really generous.
Yeah. Well, I know that you'll use discretion.
55 minutes. And thanks, Patrick and Bob, for writing this important paper. There's perhaps no better single source illustrating the larger budgetary issues surrounding the Affordable Care Act. I just want to highlight a couple of complementary issues today. In the paper, Jacob Hacker, a political scientist at Yale, is quoted on measuring the success of reform. In particular, to be successful, the ACA must be sustainable. This is an issue that Patrick just spoke about. So here's Hacker. Over the long run, if costs grow more quickly than a grab bag of revenue sources, federal deficits and the pressure to cut subsidies for coverage will grow. That is so true. However, it gets at without confronting an important question about what the economy can bear in terms of the level of revenue it is able to support. Over the last 60 years, revenue as a share of the economy has been about 18%, give or take a couple of percentage points for when the economy is doing well or poorly. This is true even though the tax system has changed rather dramatically over the period. The top marginal rate has changed, the base has changed, the types of taxes levied on different sectors of the economy have changed, and still, the tax system collects about 18% of GDP. This suggests that over the long run, we cannot expect revenues to grow more quickly than the economy. Further complicating the matter, in the case of the ACA, is that the coverage provisions encourage folks to leave the workplace and earn less, which reduces revenues on a dynamic basis. You may recall that last February, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the ACA's work disincentives would lower aggregate hours, resulting in 2.5 million fewer people working by 2024. Over the next 10 years, this amounts to a revenue loss of about $280 billion and lower economic growth. Because of the scoring rules and conventions, these effects were not included in CBO's official cost estimate of the ACA. This means that the only way that the ACA reforms will be sustainable is if the reforms bend the healthcare cost curve. That is, if they force healthcare spending to grow more slowly than the economy over the long run. However, there are at least two forces that will push back against any bending that might result from the reforms. First, if revenue does grow faster than spending, there will be intense political pressure to increase the subsidies. Second, as people become richer, as the economy grows, they tend to spend a larger share of their income to improve their health. This makes sense, as you only have one life. You might as well spend it to extend it rather than die a rich man. It's a true point. Therefore, reform is only sustainable if the spending reductions used to offset the new spending are sustainable. If not, the law will result in a debt explosion. To give you a sense of such a scenario, in 2012, the Government Accountability Office found that if the ACA was unsuccessful at cutting Medicare payments, which Bob can probably speak to the sustainability of those payments, the law would add about $6.2 trillion to primary deficits over the next 75 years. That's not, Republican or even Heritage talking points. That's the Government Accountability Office. $6.2 trillion in primary deficits over the next 75 years, or about 0.7% of GDP over that period. The next point I'd like to make really involves asking and only partially answering two questions. First, how much should the government spend? We've answered a related question in that the government can only spend what it brings in. That is, over the long run, spending cannot exceed 18% of GDP without some extraordinary measures, like inflating our way out of debt and starting over again. Second, how much of that spending should be on health care? To put it in budget speak, what should be the health care baseline? Should it be a post-Obamacare baseline or something else? This is a very tough question, but one that we need to confront. If we choose to spend what we are currently expected to spend on health care, and we are unsuccessful at bending the cost curve, either through the ACA's reforms or through some other set of reforms, spending on other priorities will be crowded out. Thanks.
All right, there we go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for questions. Please raise your hand, identify yourself, and ask the question. Somebody's got a question, I'm certain. Yes.
How much longer do you, I'm sorry. David Hochberg, National Center for Public Policy Research, and I'm just wondering, how much longer do you see the supposed Medicare cuts in Obamacare, how much longer will they be politically sustainable? How soon until the American Hospital Association and all the other groups start saying, you know, you got to rescind some of this?
I think it's a very, very difficult question. My own view is that they're not realistic over time. These are very, very significant cuts to Medicare, and you're getting a larger and larger Medicare population over time. In other words, the demand for medical services by this aging population is going to continue to grow. Not only that, of course, the medical technology does not stand still. We are starting to see some very serious advances in medical technology that will be incorporated into the routine medical services provided by Medicare A and Medicare Part B. So I expect a lot of this is going to be this is going to be a major problem, I think, going forward. The other difficulty with all of this is that besides the rapidly aging population, you are starting to see a situation with a smaller number of people who are going to be paying the bills over time. So it's not a very pretty picture. I don't see any real opportunity to change things unless we change the fundamental structure of Medicare itself, which means going from the existing system that we have today to something that can really slow spending over time in a rational way, and that is a market-based premium support system where plans and providers compete in a very, very direct way for consumers' dollars. But we're not going to get that under the current regime.
May I add something to that as well? That view about those spending reductions for institutional providers, that's not just Bob's view. The Congressional Budget Office said the same thing when they were doing estimates on the Affordable Care Act, and so did the Medicare trustees, if I remember correctly. Those cuts are very problematic, and I wouldn't try to guess how long they might hold up, but I think what we have basically is another SGR on our hands with those.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of further drive home that point, I mean, and not only has the CBO weighed in on this, but CMS has also weighed in on this and essentially said that the cuts it's difficult to sustain those cuts past 2017. As a political measure, I don't know if anyone's been to National Airport recently, but if you go in Terminal C of National Airport, it's just filled with posters on those Medicare cuts and about how Congress needs to reverse those Medicare cuts. Union Station's the same thing. So they're definitely pulling out all the stops. And I completely agree with Patrick. I mean, this is another SGR on our hands.
Yes, sir.
Matt, Internet Heritage. I was wondering, in your opinion, what is the free market solution to reducing the amount of uninsured Americans?
Oh, well, I'll take a stab at that. The fact of the matter is that most people who are uninsured are people who are uninsured for relatively short periods of time. There are a small number of people who are uninsured over a very long period of time, but what we notice about this population is that they're in and out of coverage. And they're in and out of coverage for a variety of reasons, including a change of jobs. Now, the Affordable Care Act is actually trying to solve that problem to some extent, but inadequately. Our view is that the fundamental difficulty with the structure of the health insurance market is that the tax policy undergirding that market is ineffective and also is restrictive. What we would suggest is that that there be some kind of a change in the tax code that would give people basically tax breaks regardless of where they get their health insurance. And those tax breaks can be calibrated in a number of ways, but instead of getting a tax break because you're an employee of a major corporation or even small business and so on, you would get a tax break for the offset to purchase your health insurance. And that means that health insurance would, over time, health insurance would become increasingly a matter of coverage much like life insurance, auto insurance, homeowners insurance, and there would be a high degree of portability in insurance. And once you have a high degree of portability in insurance, the number of people who are uninsured start to go down. That's a wonderful change. It requires, however, a fundamental change in the tax treatment of health insurance, which means we would have to move from what we have today, which is to say you will get almost exclusively a tax break for the purchase of coverage if and only if you get your health care coverage through the place of work. And we say to you that your coverage is not dependent upon your employment, but rather is dependent upon your citizenship, in effect. There are a lot of different ways of doing it. I'm not going to make an argument here that there is one absolutely right way of doing it. My own view is, and Heritage has long supported the idea of an individual tax credit for the purchase of insurance that would stabilize the market and make health insurance more portable from job to job. It would also, of course, do something else, which is a very positive thing, and that it would enable people to keep their health insurance for long periods of time, which would also incentivize insurers to make a number of changes in the quality of the coverage, or the kind of coverage they get, to reflect the changing needs of an individual over time. So that's the long and short of it. That's going to take another major fight on healthcare, and we'll hopefully have that in the next few years. It doesn't appear that we're going to have that in the next 2 years under this president, however.
Yeah, prior to Obamacare, there was a great deal of, sort of as Bob was mentioning, of tax inequity. Folks who received an offer of employer-sponsored coverage through their workplace essentially paid different tax rates, average tax rates, than those who didn't receive an offer of employer-sponsored coverage. Rather than fix that inequity, what the ACA essentially does is it just adds another layer on top of that. So now you have the employer-sponsored insurance system with the exclusion that's attached to that, and essentially the direct subsidies for folks participating in the exchanges, and then folks who don't have an offer of employer-sponsored coverage and are ineligible for the subsidies. So you have a tax system which is really peculiar, where you could have essentially 3 different families living in three different states, all making the same amount of money, all paying different average tax rates. And so ultimately, I would think that any move in the right direction in covering folks would also fix some of those sort of existing inequities that were present before the ACA and are very much part of the problem today.
I'll take a shot at something, a different angle on this. This is something that Bob and I and Nina and I have talked about, and it goes back to the old theme that came from Republicans about repeal and replace, which always bothered me because it sounded as if Republicans just have their own nationalized health care plan to plug in when they get rid of Obamacare. That's not true. And if you think about the question you asked, what is the free market approach? I suggest we ought to start thinking differently about that. There is not a single approach to taking care of people who are uninsured, and there may be approaches we haven't even thought of. In fact, I hope that's the case. So increasingly, we ought to start thinking about where the innovators are throughout the healthcare market, whether they're government or private sector, whether they're doctors or insurers or institutional providers. Let them show the way to innovate and reach more people. I'm sure if insurers didn't have restrictions on what they had to provide, they would find ways to come up with very inexpensive insurance policies. In fact, I think they were doing this for the 22-year-old kid who doesn't really want to spend a whole lot on it, but he thinks it might be a good idea to have insurance in case he breaks his leg or something. So what we should be looking for is not so much just the federal policy, some of that's important, but what's going on elsewhere throughout the market and throughout the states and what they can do to provide the innovation to reach more people.
Yes, that gentleman.
Well, first of all, thank you for the presentation. I'm Garcia, former Assistant Secretary for Health during the Bush administration. Oh. I have a question, two questions for you. We are expecting an increase of cancer rates in our nation by close to 22% in the next 10 years, and it has never been included in any financial modeling. Have you actually thought about any kind of modeling related to chronic diseases or cancer and how it's going to impact Medicare in the next 10, 15 years? That's the first question. And the second one is, I used to be a farm boy, and we took care of ourselves before we went to the doctor. And one of the things that I have seen here is the lack of accountability by the systems and by the people. Have you actually thought how we can improve that in terms of some people overuse the system, some people do not use the system until they get sick? And we didn't have time out when I was being raised up, so you were actually strict in terms of how you do things. So I would like the reaction from all of you.
I'll go first. Now, I think your point is profoundly valid, because what we have is an approach to healthcare which is based on categorizing people according to large groups. And the delivery of healthcare actually should be far, far more idiosyncratic to the particular problems that people actually face. We all are biologically sharing, the same basic stuff, but at the same time, biologically we're all profoundly different as a result of our genetic inheritance and susceptibility to disease and so on. The delivery system, however, is locked into this straitjacket of healthcare financing, in which basically what we do is we provide, in effect, a kind of one-size-fits-all financing arrangement that applies to everybody, regardless of their radical differences, whether it's genetic or biological or whatever, or family history and so on. And the consequence of that is that we built into this system a profound inefficiency. What we need to do is to take advantage of not only modern medicine, but modern information technology, to develop personalized healthcare on a mass scale. Now, we can do that. That is not something that is impossible to do. But we cannot do it within this 20th century structure that we have that grew up with third-party payment in 1939, 1940, 41, 42. I think we have a tendency to think of healthcare financing in terms of insurance, and that's the only way we do things. And if you just think about it, prior to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, there was about 3 to 4% of the population that actually had insurance. Now, that's not to say it was a good thing. It was just the way it was. Health insurance was an exotic thing. It was something that certain people had, or a preserve of the very rich, or people who were somewhat exotic in some other way. But the point is that healthcare financing should change. And our view is that if you open up the system to allow a lot of innovation, not only in the delivery of care, but also in the financing of care, you will start to see a lot of innovation in financing that will also be compatible with the delivery of care on a more individualized basis. Health savings accounts are a big step in that direction, huge. I think we could probably go further than that. The issue, it seems to me, is how can we get the system out of this box. And I'm not sure, I'm not sure that anything other than a radical revolution in healthcare financing, and what I mean by that is the ability to give individuals direct control over the flow of dollars will enable that kind of innovative spirit to be let loose and to be free throughout the system. I would expect it's going to take some time. It's not something that's going to take place overnight. But what we've got now, think about it, what we've got now is we've got a situation basically where you fit into a box and you have a financing system that says you will have this type of insurance, and that any change, any innovation in the insurance product is ultimately to be determined at the end of the day by some kind of a regulatory change, made by GS-15 bureaucrats at the Department of Health and Human Services, who happen to think that you might be worthy of their attention. This is a very inefficient system for a modern society that is based on radical technological innovation. I think we've got an awful lot of work to do, but I think you raise an extremely good point, and I hope that that's a partial answer to your question.
I would point to a paper that was published by the Mercatus Center this past year by a guy named Bob Grayboys. It's called Fortress and Frontier. And what he describes is very similar to what Bob was just saying, that the way healthcare has been arranged, it favors the insiders and the experts and closes doors to innovators who can come up with imaginative things. And Grayboys goes through a history of innovation in the internet and all kinds of other things and shows how applying those kinds of, applying that way of thinking could be very helpful in Medicare. So a lot of it has to do with breaking down barriers to innovation rather than constructing new regulations or new techniques or having bureaucrats come up with new great ideas of some new program to finance. Breaking down barriers to innovation is probably the biggest step we can take in the right direction, and I think Bob would agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, most health policy, frankly, is focused on the demand side. Right? It's focused on the healthcare financing, and as Bob points out, rightly so. And if you're concerned with sort of targeted endpoints like the number of uninsured and things like this, then you need to focus on the demand side. But if you're ultimately interested in improving health, which I think we all are, then you need to change that focus and move towards the supply of medicine. How is medicine being delivered? And as I'm coming in on the end of this, but as both Patrick and Bob said, you've got to fundamentally rethink about how we're spending healthcare dollars. Some of that involves changing healthcare financing. Some of that might involve other areas. Some of that might involve rethinking how HHS is involved in the system altogether, and expanding it out to NIH and CDC and private investment and et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately it would, we spend an awful lot of money on healthcare. And frankly, we can get better results for what we spend.
Let me just follow up one more thing on that. The thing is that think about health insurance and then think about the demands of a 21st century society. It's kind of, seared on my memory, but I was in the Reagan administration when we started financing the research into the human genome in a big way. And the number of these firms in California that were involved in that, there were not a lot, but they were very, very sophisticated biomedical research institutions. And now, right, we have actually done it. We have mapped the human genome. This is a huge scientific breakthrough. I mean, it's so big. I think we're so close to it. We actually, right now, we're probably so close to it, we don't even understand how big it actually is, because the actual application of that science hasn't even really begun in any great way yet in terms of the broader population. It's starting, of course. But what does that do to insurance? Think about it. Insurance is, you know, is to protect yourself against some kind of unforeseen risk. But with the mapping of the human genome, we were able to actually make a genetic, we were able to actually map out a genetic profile where you may or may not be susceptible to certain types of diseases. What does that do to insurance, which means insuring against risk? When the risk goes down, the insurance becomes less and less reasonable, right? We are not thinking correctly in healthcare financing about the future that is already here. We have to go beyond this, you know, basically mid-20th century model of healthcare financing. We haven't done that yet. That's why, for example, the idea of health savings accounts may in fact be much greater in terms of the future than, you know, basically the standard product of insurance, where you may or may not come down with something. If we are able to, through looking at, you know, our genetic profile, make a determination that you will be 85% or 90% likely to come down with a certain type of condition, you can't insure against that. That's a certainty. So you have to have some other financing mechanism. So we have to get creative. The problem is that the political system has not yet really responded to these kinds of challenges. So we're stuck debating, in effect, this mid-century style of healthcare financing, which is tied, crazily enough, to a tax policy that was drafted in World War II to simply solve a compensation problem in 1941 and 42. I mean, on one level, it looks like we're crazy, you know, that we just don't see the obvious. But we have to get beyond all of this. And because I frankly think that our healthcare financing should reflect, you know, scientific changes and scientific advances, there's a lot of opportunities here for preventive medicine on a massive scale that would improve the quality and the character of human life in the United States and other places, far more than we can even imagine right now.
I want to really thank for that statement, because we know for a fact plenty of global studies have been done and demonstrated that insurance doesn't improve health.
Oh, no.
It's access to healthcare and good healthcare quality. And Paul's point in terms of HHS should change. While I was there, we tried to be as agile as possible. Now, I mean, it's just health security. I can move things 10 times faster than when I was 13 at ASH of the United States. And I think the issue of IT and innovation, and I really think that that's how we should think about healthcare, not reacting, but in a proactive way. So I really applaud it.
Thank you very much. There is a colleague of ours who served briefly in the Reagan administration by the name of Richard Teskey. He passed away. He was an assistant secretary at HHS during the Reagan administration. He said to me, and I'll never forget his comment, he said, the great revolution will take place when political authorities really understand what is at stake and they marry the chip and the cell. Very, very good point. Yes, Nina? Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much. So this is shifting gears a little bit, but I would be curious, based on Pat's comments, what kind of changes can be made so within the process so that we can get back on track and we're not simply spending with paper savings? What are those? Are there elements that we can identify that can help Congress kind of restore its principles on these things?
One, I would say, and it doesn't rely on estimating practices, is what a lot of people have been recommending for some time, and that is put spending caps on entitlements. There's something contradictory about that because of the way entitlements are designed, but you could still do it. You could just cap Medicare, for example, at a certain level, and if you reach that level before the end of the year, then Congress has to decide whether to appropriate more money for Medicare or whether to make some changes to get through the end of the year or what have you. That would be one way to do it. I think people always say this, a good look at the spending baselines and perhaps some reform of them would be helpful also, because as we know right now, the Medicare baseline is absurd. I mean, it assumes the SGR will take place, even though everyone knows it's not going to, and it still assumes those $700 billion from the ACA, and it double counts them. So some serious reform of baselines might be helpful also. I'll try to think of some other ones as well, but those are two that come to mind immediately.
Longer budget window. That's a, you know, there's so much, as Patrick knows. I mean, there's so much gaming that happens in the 10-year budget window, that expanding that out, especially when we're talking about entitlement reform, really makes a tremendous amount of sense. It takes options off the table. It forces folks to think more deeply about long-term trends, about demographics behind those long-term trends. You know, getting into the, you know, when, I mean, really, this is a very large question that probably involves rethinking different parts of the 74 Congressional Budget Act. You know, when the 74 Act was written, this is a shock to, I think, most people. You know, discretionary spending was the largest portion of federal spending. I mean, entitlements were not a big deal. And ultimately, the CBA of 74 is just not equipped to handle entitlement spending. You know, so and this is one of the, you know, this is sort of, you know, inside baseball. You know, budget rules and appropriations rules matter, are very significant. Yet it's difficult to translate a lot of that stuff outside of, you know, these few blocks. And so what ends up happening is that OMB, CBO, and the budget committees essentially talk to each other, and that's about it. that's all that happens. You know, but ultimately, you know, like I said, I mean, going back and rethinking the budget process in those terms, what do we need to get under control? Maybe that means even something that doesn't have to do with entitlement spending per se, but, you know, moving towards a biannual budget, where you don't put this significant influence on discretionary spending every year. And so that provides Congress with at least a little bit of time to think about other longer-term issues. But really, you know, there needs to be, if not an overhaul, some serious consideration about what the federal budget process should look like, given spending priorities and given the trajectory of the entitlement spending.
Yes, Ed.
Yeah, Ed Heisselmeyer, Heritage. You know, I was listening to your answer, Patrick, to Nina's question, and it sparked a question in my mind, and you mentioned the entitlement capping concept. And the question, or the thing that sparked in my mind, is you have an entitlement Medicaid where the costs are shared by the states as well as the federal government, but states have balanced budgets, and they have to deal with that in a very different fashion, and it strikes me that it's probably much more like what you're talking about, which is that they budget for what they expect Medicaid to be, and then if that turns out to be not enough, you know, they have a special session, they have to come up with something to do. Are there things there in terms of lessons and insights that could be gained for applying it to the federal level?
Yeah, I'm sure they are, and for exactly what you described. They have to budget for it. That's a concept that's kind of been lost in Washington, the notion of budgeting for things. And in fact, the entitlements they're designed, as Paul was describing them, they're out of control because they're designed to be out of control. And that seems to me the first thing that Congress needs to do is get a grip on that and put all the entitlements under some kind of control and make it stick. It's not easy to do because there's a debate. You know, there are the appropriated entitlements such as food stamps, and there's a discussion about what would happen because formally the appropriators still have to approve the spending, even though the spending goes on the baseline. But there's always a question about what would happen if the appropriators didn't do that. And most people think that legally the benefit payments would go out anyway, even without that. So somehow you'd have to design spending caps, real budgets on entitlement programs or on entitlement spending broadly in some way and make them stick. And by the way, one thought I've had for those of you who are familiar with the budget process is to put those spending caps in a reconciliation bill and only there for a couple of reasons. That would mean that if you wanted to alter the caps, you would have to do a reconciliation again, which means you would do the cap adjustments in the context of broader entitlement spending. And second, to do a reconciliation bill, you have to do a budget resolution, and so that would create another incentive for Congress to do what it hasn't been doing for the past several years.
Thanks. I can't let the Heritage colleagues ask all the friendly questions. So. John Graham, National Center for Policy Analysis. I'm just wondering to maybe...
That's not always a friendly question.
No. For the last little while now, we've been in a world where whenever the CBO does its new baseline, the media say, this is great, they're ratcheting down the estimates. I guess maybe you sort of already answered the question because you've noted that CMS itself says by 2017 the hospital will get to punch through what they've got. But how do you see that evolving over the next little while? Is this little honeymoon that we've had in the healthcare spending baselines, is it going to turn around quickly, or?
Short answer is yes. I mean, ultimately, what you're talking about is there's been a reduction in per capita spending in Medicare. A significant portion of that reduction has been driven by lower drug prices. A significant portion of that spending has also been driven by the economy. I hope the economy improves, and I hope that there's more drug development that's been going on, over the last 10 years. So ultimately, and I think a lot of people have expressed, without saying something I probably shouldn't say, but I've for the last 4 years, I've sat in on the panel of health advisors meetings with the Congressional Budget Office, and I will say that there is a high level of skepticism in some of the assumptions that CBO has made about the projections of per capita healthcare spending, and that skepticism is I know that that's not a shocking comment, and it's for a variety of reasons. But I think that yeah, I mean, the good times have probably ended. The question is when there will be a revision upwards. I think that some of the skepticism is being reflected in the current SGR debates. There's a real drive to get this full and permanent doc fix done right now. And you've got to believe that some of that is driven by the fact that folks are worried that the fire sale will go away pretty soon.
I would just simply comment on that. What we're seeing right now, and this is not meant to be a political speech, but the point is what we're seeing right now is a complete reversal of the Republican leadership position on the doc fix. I mean, let's make sure everybody understands this. During the debate on Obamacare back in 2009 and 2010, House Speaker Boehner pretty much laid down the law on this issue and said, in effect, that there was an absolute necessity for Congress to fully finance the doc fix. And on November 19th, he made a statement saying that, in effect, that if they did not do this, this was a crime against our children and our grandchildren, right? That's what he said. And the congressional leadership said at the time they wanted to junk the Medicare formula. But what we're looking at now is something that is really quite remarkable, which is that the congressional leadership is now saying they'll pay for about $70 billion of the $213 billion that they are prepared to spend over the next 10 years. And $35 billion of that is going to be based on some minor changes, which are frankly very, very timid in the Medicare entitlement, both Medigap in the Medigap area and in means testing. I mean, they are, believe me, they are timid. The fact of the matter is what is happening is that we're being basically saying, we're being lulled into accepting, you know, another major expansion of deficit spending under a regime, a new political regime in Congress that has pledged to change the rules of the game in a positive direction. And right now, this is their first big test, and they're going exactly in the opposite direction. And that's just an absolute fact.
Bob and I will go out in the back later on and have this out. But another way,
Better be in shape.
another way I might respond to that is government spending accounts for roughly half of national health expenditures, if I'm correct. Medicare and Medicaid are about a third. When you're pouring that much government money into any sector, it's going to make it inefficient. It's going to start spending more than it should. I mean, government is notoriously inefficient about its spending. Now we've added another layer to that with the ACA. From that point of view, I would say it's inevitable that healthcare inflation is going to pick up. And I would bet, I've never done this, but it would be interesting to go back to 1965 and see what medical inflation was at that time when people were paying a lot out of pocket. And then look at how inflation tracked as Medicare and Medicaid expanded and then other public health programs. And I'll bet you'll find they went in a similar direction. But in any case, pouring more government money into healthcare is only going to, in the long run, drive healthcare inflation just as it's doing with college tuitions.
Yeah. In 1965, actually, about 50% of healthcare spending was out of pocket. I mean, very, very little comparatively, compared to what we have today.
Warren Madison, your comments about 1965, if I'm not mistaken, I think that was heavily debated in the Congress. And I think the opposition, I think it was the Republican Party, was that there's no telling what the future cost of Medicare might be. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Johnson actually said that would cost $10 billion within 25 years, which would then bring it up to 1992 roughly. And what was in it 1992, if I remember the numbers correctly, it was about $25 billion. So that's a huge jump.
Right.
And what do we see it now? I'm not even sure where it is. I don't think anybody knows where it is. When I listen to everything you're saying, what strikes me is that there is a total lack of understanding of the ramifications of all the different proposals, implementation pieces here and there. From a, let's say, a system engineering point of view, there is no attempt being made to really look at the overall picture, and I think it's become impossible. You know, we started out, for example, with a 2,700-page document, which even Pelosi said we have to pass it to understand it. Nobody really understands it. What we see today is the splitting out of that document across government lines, nobody really understanding it. All these things, everything you're talking about keeps popping up here, there, and everywhere. A simple thing, for example, they talk about subsidies. I have yet to hear anybody come out with an estimate what will be the cost of subsidies to people, however they define, they're giving out low income or whatever it is. Things like that, there is no analysis, and out of the clear blue, we get hit with additional increases, additional debt, and we're in serious, serious trouble. I'd like to have somebody respond to why we can't put together, you mentioned health savings accounts. We hear a lot of positive things, but yet not fully understood. Maybe there are things like that that should be somehow analyzed, brought to the minds of the public so they understand what they're getting into. Obamacare is a sheer disaster. Having insurance for everybody does not guarantee that you got medical care for everybody.
That's right.
And I think what you're seeing in the medical profession, a lot of doctors are considering bowing out. Medical school enrollment is down, as I understand it. But nobody is really getting hold of this monster. Could somebody explain why?
You take that one, Bob.
Well, first of all, I think it is a monster. I think it is a very dangerous monster politically. It's very, very easy to demagogue this issue. when people try to make changes that are perfectly rational, they're often faced with terrible propaganda at their expense. I can recall many examples of that. The other side of this, and very frankly, it's the way in which our system works in some respects, or doesn't work, and that is that this is an area where you have an enormous stake by very, very powerful special interest in the status quo. I mean, you've got to understand that, whether it's the insurance industry, whether it's members of the medical community and so on. And these very powerful forces put a check on significant changes. Right now, for example, I mean, we're all concerned about right now, we're having a big debate on whether, in fact, we ought to establish a rational system for paying physicians in the future. We want to do it in a fiscally responsible way, but members of the medical profession are perfectly happy, according to everything I read, in imposing another massive deficit on the public that will be anywhere at least $130 billion over the next 10 years, and could go on to amount to literally trillions in the future if we don't do this right. If you talked about this to ordinary people, a lot of the folks would say, SGR, what is that? We were talking about this earlier, but there is a kind of a disconnect between what is going on in this city and how it is affecting, in a very profound way, really, the personal lives of millions of Americans. I think part of it is a failure of communication, and part of it is simply the sheer complexity of what we're dealing with. Very frankly, if Ronald Reagan were alive today, God bless him, I think if he were to take on an issue like this, he would be able to get on that television and explain to the American people in a very, very simple and effective way what they're faced with. And based on past experience, they would believe him. But that's the kind of, we need politically skilled people to handle this issue.
To back up Bob's comments, one thing that when I was taking a look at the president's request for Health and Human Services, I was shocked to see that for the next fiscal year, for fiscal year 2016, about $1 trillion passes through Health and Human Services every year. I mean, that is phenomenal. That's larger than the GDP of Switzerland. One agency. And that, I think, is a little neat statistic that encompasses so much of what we're talking about here. And also says a lot about the power of HHS, about the power of the secretary, and ultimately those who are employed by the agency.
Anybody else have any questions? Nobody is morally outraged.
Patrick is morally outraged.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, he's always.
I grew up that way.
All right. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This is. Please give our panelists a hand.